Hello, patrons. It is me, Dave, your humble author and narrator, and I'm doing these weekly digs for you, my patrons and loyal supporters. I'm just going to talk about science fiction. I'm going to talk about books I've read, maybe some stuff that isn't science fiction, but I want to do some dives into books, just talk about them for a few minutes. I get a lot of, just from the other podcast, the Sofa King podcast, I get a lot of people on social media asking me for book recommendations, and even just as an English professor, I get people asking me for book recommendations. So I'm going to kind of nerd out on these videos, and I'll pick a book per video. I'll talk about why I like it, why it's one of my favorites, do a no spoil kind of discussion of it. I need to find a name for the segment. I don't know what to call it. The nerd on novels, the tome tumbler, I don't know, book babble. You can leave something in the comments. That's much better than those, and we'll go ahead and get a name for these segments. But I want to post them. Just one more way to say thank you for the patronage, and to talk about some books. So my first book was published in 1984. There was something magical in the air in 1984, I think, when it comes to science fiction. It might have been because that's when Orwell said all of his stuff was going to happen. But I think fondly of The Terminator, which came out in 1984, one of the all-time greats of science fiction film. But and even though it wasn't necessarily 1984, Blade Runner had just come out. The movie Brazil was going to come out the following year, but there was this weird vibe of non-human intervention and cybernetics. And I mean, even the Terminator was a cyborg. He wasn't necessarily an alien. But all of this together culminates, to me, in one of the all-time greats of science fiction. And it is William Gibson's novel, Neuromancer. It's a book that I like so much that I own 3 different copies of. One is enough, but this one my brother borrowed, and he left in his car, and he didn't know it was in his car, and his car had no back windows, and it got rained on, so it's kind of moldy and crunchy, but it was my first Neuromancer, so I reclaimed it. The second one I bought just so I had a clean one to read, and then the third one I bought because I'm a big nerd. And I went down to see William Gibson speak in Pasadena to get one of his newer books signed. And he kindly signed my copy of Neuromancer that I bought at that visit. But the reason that Neuromancer is a favorite of mine is because my first trilogy of novels that starts with 181 Pine and then goes to Caretaker and then part 3, which will be out hopefully soon, which is called The Singularity Sisters. But it's kind of what you would call cyberpunk. And William Gibson, along with 1 or 2 other authors, everyone pretty much points to Gibson, and they say he was the father of cyberpunk. He was the one who created this genre. And it's a genre of sprawling megacities. It's a genre of cyborgs, people who have their body parts replaced with mechanics, people who have parts of their brains replaced with computers. I mean, he did write Johnny Mnemonic, the little-known Keanu Reeves version of a short story of his, but Gibson is known for cyberpunk and cyberspace. And in fact, one of the reasons this book is so important is because the entire concept of the matrix, of cyberspace, of a space that exists inside the computers, something you would have seen in Tron a couple years later, it's his idea. This is pure William Gibson. In the story, there's a guy named Case, and he jacks into what they call cyberspace for the first time ever. Like right now, it's like, yo, in cyberspace. But I'm just trying to imagine being the one to conceive of this in the first place. And cyberspace for him is an information domain where banks and corporations have physical structures in this net domain. So if you wanted to hack into Nike has a structure in cyberspace that is guarded and protected. It's almost like a physical entity that you have to travel to get in. And it's dangerous. And Case himself is injured. He ended up having his neurological system damaged in the past, so he can't jack into cyberspace. and he gets into a weird kind of life and death adventure, along with a woman who's sort of a cyber samurai, named Molly Millions, great name. And they start having weird encounters with corporate entities and artificial intelligences and all sorts of stuff. But it's a great book. His style is unbelievable. The Gibson is one of the people who, when I read it, I read Gibson several times when I get one of his books. I'll read it to get through the story, and then usually about 6 months later, right, if I read it over the winter during a vacation, I save a Gibson book. If there's a new Gibson book, I save it until I can, like, really binge. But on my next vacation, 6 months later, I read it a second time to kind of pay attention to his structure, and then I usually read it a third time a year or two later. Or if I'm editing, I get into a mode where I start editing fiction, and Gibson is one of the people that I start to read because I'm just fascinated by how he's constructing his sentences, what he's doing, how he's pulling it off. Because usually about once every couple of pages, I'll be reading William Gibson, and it just stops me cold, and I have to look at a sentence that he wrote or the way he described something, and I just think that was perfection. Like, that was so good, and it just stops me in my tracks. And when I reread Neuromancer, it blows me away because it was his first novel. He wrote it in less than a year because he had, I guess, Ace Books was doing a contest, and they wanted to get new authors that had success publishing science fiction short stories. There's still a thriving market for science fiction short stories, and he was really good at them. And they saw him, and they were like, let's give him a book contract. So he had 1 year to write Neuromancer. And he pulled it off. He said that he rewrote the beginning of the book about 12 times before he finally settled on something that he didn't think sucked. He said that Blade Runner was a big impact on what he was doing, but he also said that it was already, the way the city looked in this cyber genre was already in his head. And he said that he was worried because Blade Runner came out, and then 2 years later when Neuromancer came out, he said that he thought that everybody was going to just think he was ripping off Ridley Scott's visual style with how he envisioned the world. But very powerful book, very good book. He wrestles a lot with, like, the sort of the world is the same as the character. So Case, the main character, he ends up, he's a broken man. He used to be a whole man and a net runner, and because of past misdeeds, his neural network is broken, and he can't put himself together the way that he used to be. And he lives in a world that is perpetually broken and can't put itself back together. And when Gibson writes his stories, the thing that I love about it is he doesn't let you off the hook. He'll drop a slang word, he'll drop a major event, and he won't tell you what it is. And the only equivalent I can think of is if we were talking right now in a casual conversation, and someone said, hey, where were you on 9/11? And you said, oh, I was asleep, and a friend of mine called and woke me up. And you can kind of leave it at that. There's never a point in the conversation where you stop and you say, hey, where were you on 9/11? You remember that day where terrorists hijacked airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Towers, and they both collapsed on live television with the entire world watching. And then as an aftermath, they ended up increasing American security, and patriotism spiked, and blah, blah, blah. And there was a war on terror. We don't say any of that stuff. You just say 9/11. And everybody around you knows what you're talking about, and you just move on. And Gibson kind of does that with major world events. He just drops hints about wars. He does little things like that. And it's all there. It's all in the book. But you have to put it together. Another thing that I really love about William Gibson is this book, Neuromancer, is the first part of what people call the Sprawl trilogy. And it went, I forget the exact order. Neuromancer was first, and then it was, I believe, Mona Lisa Overdrive, and then Count Zero. And what Gibson does is he writes a book that is a self-contained story. You don't need anything other than what you just read. And then a couple of years later, he releases another book, which is a completely different self-contained story. Usually it doesn't have the same characters. It's completely different, but you feel like it might be in the same world that the last book, but there's no concrete evidence that that's the case. And then he releases a third book that usually merges one character from the first book, one character from the second book. And it as well stands on its own. If you didn't read either of the other books, you have no problems. You can get along with it. You can read it. You get a complete story. But if you've read all three of the books, all three of them make this story that was being built on in both of the first books and then concludes in the third book. And it's unbelievable. And he does it time after time. He's done it, I think 4 times. He's written these sort of trilogies that don't feel like trilogies. But when you get to the third one, you're like, oh, snap, this is all coming together in this really, really cool way. But Neuromancer, you can find it used anywhere. You can get it new and support him. I've seen him talk a couple of different times, and he's just this very cool, low-key guy. There's a documentary that's kind of hard to find called No Maps for These Territories, and I think, if I remember right, the band U2 produced it because they were huge fans of William Gibson. And I know that Bono and The Edge both do readings and narration during the documentary. But the concept of the documentary is they put William Gibson in the back of a limousine and they just drive around letting him talk about stuff for a couple of hours, and then they edit it together and sort of get his take on all these different topics. But it's a really cool documentary from a really cool author. The opening of the book, I think, kind of gives you a hint at his style and whether or not you'll like it. So I'm just going to read the first little bit. I'll try to probably read a section out of some of the books as we do these videos, depending on your feedback, right? In the comments below, leave me feedback. What do you wish I would have said about the book? What should I have cut out? What might I have included? I'm doing these videos for you all, so I want it to be helpful. I want it to be informative. I want it to be somewhat educational. I know that if you're not a big sci-fi nerd, you might not care about some of these videos, but I'm definitely looking for your feedback. So anything at all, go ahead and let me know what it is. So Neuromancer opens with, the sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. It's not like I'm using, Case heard someone say as he shouldered his way through the crowd around the door of the chat. It's like my body developed this massive drug deficiency. It was a sprawl voice and a sprawl joke. The Chatsubo was a bar for professional expatriates. You could drink there for a week and never hear 2 words in Japanese. Rats was tending bar, his prosthetic arm jerking monotonously as he filed a tray of glasses with draft Corinne. He saw Case and smiled, his teeth a webwork of East European steel and brown decay. Case found a place at the bar, between the unlikely tan on one of Lonnie Zone's whores and the crisp naval uniform of a tall African whose cheekbones were ridged with precise rows of tribal scars. Wage was in here early with 2 Joe boys, Rat said, shoving a draft across the bar with his good hand. Maybe some business with you, Case? Case shrugged. The girl to his right giggled and nudged him. The bartender's smile widened. His ugliness was the stuff of legend. In an age of affordable beauty, there was something heraldic about his lack of it. The antique arm whined as he reached for another mug. It was a Russian military prosthesis. Easy for you to say. It was a Russian military prosthesis. Pink plastic. You are too much the artiste, Case, Rats grunted. The sound served him as laughter. He scratched his overhang of white-shirted belly with a pink claw. You're the artiste of the slightly funny deal. Sure, Case said, and sipped his beer. Somebody's got to be funny around here. Sure the fuck isn't you. So, you can see just even in that opening bit, I mean, we've got Japanese hookers, we've got Japanese beer, we have a German who lost his arm and has a Russian prosthetic. We've got an American, the African naval officer, all of this stuff combined, and we just see this ultimate fragmented world. And he eventually moves to the sprawl, which is this cityscape that runs from Boston to Tampa. Basically, the entire East Coast is one endless city in this future, and that's where it is. So if you like something that is somewhat of a dystopia, if you like cyberpunk, if you like to see, even if you're just curious, where did the term cyberpunk come from and how did he envision it and what did he do, or if you just want a really good language ride, Neuromancer is the place to go. Don't look for easy answers. Look for a book that's going to keep you wondering, what the hell did that mean? What the hell's going on? Who the hell is this guy, for quite a while? In fact, when I read Neuromancer, I didn't read the other two in the trilogy. I didn't read Mona Lisa Overdrive or Count Zero. And when I got to his second trilogy, which they call the Bridge Trilogy, and I saw what he did, I went back to read, I believe I went back to read Count Zero, and I was reading it and I was disappointed because I was like, this is a ripoff. The girl in Count Zero, who has a totally different name, just seems like a complete ripoff of the girl from Neuromancer. Like he's just recycling his own stuff, and I thought it was weak. And then all of a sudden I put together, oh no, that is the girl from Neuromancer. He's not ripping himself off. He's just writing the same character again. But anyway, that's my first pick. If I was going to tell someone who's into science fiction, who hadn't read very much science fiction, where should I start? I might likely start with Neuromancer. Not necessarily because it's the best piece of science fiction I've read. I would probably put that on a different book, and I'll probably talk about it next week. But because of its impact it had on me, it made me see that science fiction wasn't just, Chewbacca and a robot and we're in outer space and there's space aliens. It wasn't a science fiction that looked at the differences of the external world. It was science fiction that looked inside at the differences of the internal world. We get this cyberspace, which doesn't exist. It's not a real place. And we're going inside, not outside. It's kind of a weird way to explain it, and I'm not sure how else to do it, but I just saw this piece of science fiction that was so utterly different than anything else. It didn't involve a space opera and lasers, and it was very gritty, and it was very down to earth, and I really liked that. And I liked the way that he built mystery, and he put in things that he didn't explain right away, because it just wasn't the time. The characters know it, and he knows it, and you just have to go along on the ride and trust that it's all going to come together, and Gibson always delivers. And I think, to be honest, that greatly impacted my style. I like to write stories that seem somewhat fragmented. I never come at the story in a straight direction. I feel like people are interested in more than that with science fiction. I think the detective work that I find in a Gibson book of putting the pieces together and trying to assemble it together, when you get to, say, page 200 or 250 in a Gibson book, and finally you start to go, oh, that's who that person is, and they were the one over here, and this connects here, and now these two are in the same room, even though one of them started across the world and this one started over here. And when it all starts to click and come together, there's just this magical moment where I literally cannot put the book down for the final 100 pages until I reach the finish line. So I think that really impacted me, and it made me think of writing and the structure of telling stories completely differently, which is to have faith that your audience is going to be smart enough to pick up the clues and start to string things together, to have faith that your audience is patient enough to keep going until they start to see those patterns emerge. I just think it's a wonderful way to tell a story, and I credit a great deal of the way I view storytelling to William Gibson, and it all starts here with Neuromancer, which again, it isn't my favorite science fiction book. It isn't even my favorite William Gibson book, not by a mile. There are several Gibson books that I would rank above this book and suggest you might want to go read first. In fact, I would probably say read Virtual Light before you read this one, but I wanted to start with Neuromancer just because of the impact it had on me. So hope that was helpful for some of you. Hope you learned something. Hope you go pick up the book. Again, in the comments, tell me all kinds of stuff. Tell me books you'd like me to talk about. If I've read them, I will definitely talk about them. Tell me a name that we can give this segment that I'm going to do every week, because I need a clever name, and I'm too tired right now to think of one. Tell me what stuff you'd like me to include in these discussions of the books. If you want me to do a deeper dig in the characters, or if you want me to not read from it ever again, dear Lord, or if you want me to read more from it, or whatever, I am totally open to you guys, my wonderful patrons. Again, thanks to Brent Van Tassel. He is down at the computer shop being a responsible member of society. And thanks to Zach Smith, who always has the patience to listen to our stuff in its raw form and come up with questions to help lead the sit down. Thanks to everybody from the Sofa King universe. Thanks to the patrons. Thanks to everybody. So I would say the Larry is closing, but this is about a different book, so I don't need to. Keep on reading, keep on listening, and thanks for the support.